In the quiet southern town of Ridgewood, Anthony Daniels has spent years battling unseen forces, racism, corruption, and a system resistant to change. As the first black police chief, he's built a fragile bridge of trust between the law enforcement and the community. But one fateful night, everything shatters. What begins as a routine traffic stop on a dark, winding road turns into a brutal betrayal when Anthony is attacked by two of his own officers. Left for dead, he faces the ultimate test of survival, walking miles through the night with nothing but his determination to uncover the truth. But as Anthony fights for justice, he stumbles upon a web of lies that runs deeper than he ever imagined. Betrayed by those closest to him, Anthony must decide how far he's willing to go to expose the corruption within his department, and if he can ever trust anyone again. Shadow of the Badge is a gripping tale of power, betrayal, and the relentless fight for justice, where trust is a dangerous game and no one is safe from the shadows lurking beneath the surface. Anthony Daniels leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo on his desk, a picture of his graduation day from the police academy. He sighed deeply. The station had felt heavier these days, the subtle resistance from his officers growing stronger. He knew why. As the town's first black police chief, his reforms weren't popular with everyone, especially those who had been comfortable with the old ways. Miles Richardson, his second in command, knocked on the open door, leaning against the frame. "You heading home, Chief?" Anthony nodded. "Long day. You should wrap up too, Miles." Miles smirked. "You know me. I live here." There was a flicker in his eyes, something that Anthony couldn't quite place. But it was late, and he was tired. "Good night," Anthony said as he grabbed his coat and left the office. Driving home, Anthony rolled down his window, letting the cool evening breeze wash over him. The streets of Ridgewood were quiet, just as they always were at this hour. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced at the screen. "Rumors are spreading fast, Chief. Might want to look into it." It was from a trusted officer, one who had alerted him before to potential problems within the department. Anthony shook his head. Tomorrow, he thought, pocketing the phone. For now, he wanted peace, just one evening without the weight of leadership pressing on his chest. But that peace wouldn't last. Suddenly, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, blinding him. A car sped past, swerving recklessly between lanes. Instinctively, Anthony flipped on his lights and hit the gas, his training kicking in. His hands tightened on the wheel as he pursued the speeding vehicle down the dark, winding road. "What the hell are you doing?" he muttered under his breath as the car continued to veer dangerously, nearly missing an oncoming truck. His badge sat on the passenger seat, a reminder of who he was. Whoever this was, they were going to get a rude awakening. The reckless car finally slowed and pulled over to the side of the road. Anthony parked behind them, stepping out cautiously. He approached the driver's side, shining his flashlight into the window. His heart skipped a beat as two familiar faces emerged from the shadows. Tom Briggs and Eddie Garcia. Both were officers under his command. "Evening, Chief," Tom sneered. "What's the rush?" Anthony frowned. "You almost caused a wreck back there. What the hell is going on?" Tom stepped out of the car, towering over him. "You sure you want to ask questions, Daniels?" Before Anthony could respond, Eddie circled behind him. It happened fast. A shove, a punch to the gut. Anthony staggered back, winded. "What are you doing?" he gasped. Tom smirked. "Showing you what happens when you mess with us." Anthony hit the ground hard, gravel digging into his palms as he struggled to catch his breath. Another kick to his ribs sent him rolling onto his side, pain shooting through his body. "I'm your chief," Anthony gasped, clutching his side. "Not for long," Eddie hissed, yanking Anthony's wallet and phone from his pocket. Through blurred vision, Anthony watched as they climbed back into their car. The engine roared to life, and then they were gone, leaving him bleeding and broken on the side of the road. For a moment, all was silent, save for the distant hum of crickets. But Anthony's mind was racing. This wasn't just a random attack. It was something much darker. And as he lay there, pain throbbing through every inch of his body, he knew one thing. He had to survive. Anthony Daniels groaned as he shifted on the cold, unforgiving gravel. His body screamed with pain, especially his ribs where the officers had kicked him relentlessly. Slowly, he pushed himself up, gritting his teeth against the agony radiating through his body. "Come on, Anthony, get up," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. His mind raced, replaying the betrayal, the blows, the laughter of the men who were supposed to respect him. His vision swam, but he refused to give in to the darkness. One step at a time, he stood, every movement a fresh wave of pain. "Gotta get back. I need to." His legs wobbled, but his resolve was stronger. He had to survive, not just for himself, but for the truth. He took a slow, shaky step forward. The road stretched endlessly before him, dark and desolate. Anthony stumbled, his vision blurred with pain, but he forced himself to keep moving. The quiet rustling of leaves and distant chirps of crickets were the only sounds accompanying his strained breaths. Every step felt like a mile. "They knew," he whispered to the empty road. "They planned this." He couldn't shake the feeling that this attack wasn't just about him being in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was something deeper, something darker lurking within the department. The thought of conspiracy gnawed at him. His mind replayed the moments leading up to the ambush, searching for clues. "They wanted me out," he said bitterly. "But why now?" Anthony's legs buckled, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. His ribs screamed with every inhale, but he couldn't afford to stop. "You've been through worse," he whispered to himself, memories of his time in the military flooding his mind. He had faced enemies before, but this time the enemy came from within his own force, his own brothers in blue. "I'm not dying here," he growled, forcing himself up again. His eyes focused on the faint glow of Ridgewood's distant lights. "Not like this." Each step felt like a monumental effort, but Anthony's determination kept him moving. He wasn't just fighting to stay alive. He was fighting for justice. He would get back, and he would expose the truth. A car's headlights broke the darkness, illuminating Anthony's battered figure. He waved his good arm frantically, almost collapsing from the effort. The car slowed, and a man in his 40s stepped out, eyes wide in shock. "Chief Daniels? What the hell happened to you?" the man asked, rushing to Anthony's side. "Ambush by my own," Anthony rasped, leaning heavily against the car. His body trembled as the man helped him into the passenger seat. "We need to get you to the hospital. You're in no shape to." "No," Anthony cut him off, his voice hoarse but firm. "Police station first." The driver hesitated, but the look in Anthony's eyes left no room for argument. "All right, Chief. Hang in there." The fluorescent lights of the hospital room buzzed overhead, and the nurse hovered over Anthony, taking his vitals. "You need to rest, Chief," she said gently, noting the severity of his injuries. But Anthony shook his head, groaning as he sat up. "No time. I need to call my department. You've got broken ribs and internal bruising, not to mention the concussion. You could barely walk when they brought you in." "I'll deal with it later," Anthony insisted, reaching for his phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed. "I need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the line connected, Anthony's eyes narrowed. He knew this was far from over. Anthony Daniels limped through the front doors of the Ridgewood police station. The harsh fluorescent lights hurt his eyes, but he ignored the pain. As soon as he walked in, the room fell silent. Officers glanced up from their desks, their eyes widening at the sight of their battered chief. Lieutenant Miles Richardson hurried toward him. "Chief, what happened? You look like hell." "I was attacked, Miles. By two of our own, Tom and Eddie," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Miles feigned surprise, his eyes narrowing. "Tom and Eddie? That can't be right. Are you sure?" "Positive. I need everyone in the conference room. Now." As Miles walked away to gather the team, Anthony's instincts told him something was off. He couldn't trust anyone, not yet. The room filled slowly, officers taking their seats around the long table. Anthony stood at the front, his hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. "I was ambushed last night," Anthony began, his voice firm. "Two officers, Tom Briggs and Eddie Garcia, attacked me, robbed me, and left me for dead." Murmurs of shock rippled through the room. Miles raised his hand. "Chief, are you sure about this?" It's a serious accusation. Anthony's eyes flicked to him. I wouldn't say it if I wasn't. This wasn't random. There's more going on here. Miles' face remained unreadable, but the faintest hint of tension in his posture confirmed Anthony's growing suspicion. Something was very wrong. Anthony issued orders swiftly. I want a full-scale manhunt for Tom and Eddie. Every officer is to report any sightings immediately. Some officers nodded, others exchanged uneasy glances. As the group dispersed, Miles lingered behind. Chief, are you sure you're thinking clearly? You're injured. You should rest. I'll rest when those men are behind bars. Anthony shot back, his patience wearing thin. We need to act quickly. Miles frowned. Of course, Chief. I'm just concerned for your well-being. Anthony watched him leave, the nagging suspicion now a steady thrum in the back of his mind. Miles was hiding something, but for now, his focus had to be on the manhunt. Later that evening, Anthony found himself alone in his office, reviewing security footage from the station. He paused, rewinding the tape. Miles' car was in the station parking lot at the same time Tom and Eddie were supposed to be on patrol. Anthony's heart raced. He stared at the screen, replaying the footage again. Miles knew. He whispered to himself. The realization sent a chill down his spine. His second-in-command wasn't just negligent. He was part of the conspiracy. The next morning, Anthony summoned Officer Johnson, one of the few officers he trusted completely. Johnson, I need you to do something for me, Anthony said, leaning forward. Look into Miles' recent activity. Keep it quiet. Don't let him know we're watching. Johnson nodded. I've had my suspicions about him too, Chief. I'll dig into it. As Johnson left, Anthony sat back in his chair, the weight of betrayal heavy on his shoulders. He knew now that the attack wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was part of something much larger. The battle ahead would be more dangerous than he ever imagined. Anthony Daniels sat alone in his office, the light from his computer screen casting long shadows across the room. His injuries still ached, but the pain wasn't enough to distract him from the growing web of corruption he was uncovering. Files were spread out in front of him, records of suspicious activity over the past several months. As he pieced together the evidence, one thing became clear. Miles Richardson had been orchestrating something far bigger than Anthony had realized. Anthony frowned as he reviewed a series of questionable transfers Miles had authorized. This wasn't just negligence. He's been covering his tracks. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Officer Johnson stepped in. Chief, you wanted an update? Anthony nodded. What did you find on Miles? Johnson hesitated, then handed him a file. It's worse than we thought. He's been involved in illegal deals with several officers, going back years. Anthony's jaw clenched. He had suspected as much, but seeing it confirmed only fueled his anger. Later that night, Anthony met with a former officer, James Fields, who had left the force under suspicious circumstances. They met at a small diner on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. You sure you want to talk about this now? Fields asked, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I don't have a choice, Anthony replied, leaning forward. I need to know how deep this runs. Fields sighed. Deeper than you think. Miles has been running things behind the scenes for years. He's got half the department in his pocket. You try to take him down, you'll be taking on the entire system. Anthony's stomach tightened. Why didn't you say something before? I tried, but no one would listen. They're all scared of him. Anthony shook his head. Not anymore. Back at the station, Anthony confronted Miles the next morning. The tension between them was palpable as Anthony walked into the office where Miles was working, trying to act as if everything were normal. Miles, Anthony said, his voice cool. We need to talk. Miles looked up, a faint smile on his lips. What's on your mind, Chief? Anthony stepped closer. I've been looking into some things. Transfers, deals. All roads seem to lead back to you. Miles raised an eyebrow, still calm. I don't know what you're implying, but I've been doing my job like everyone else. Don't play dumb, Anthony growled. I know what you've been up to. Miles' smile faded, his eyes hardening. Be careful, Anthony. You don't want to make enemies in your own department. Anthony's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. I already have. As the manhunt for Tom and Eddie intensified, Anthony received a tip from one of his trusted officers, Johnson, about a secret meeting Miles had arranged with several other officers. The location was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, hidden from prying eyes. "Chief, I've got intel that Miles is planning something big tonight," Johnson informed him, urgency in his voice. "He's gathering his people. We should move now." Anthony nodded. "Get a team ready. This ends tonight." The air was thick with anticipation as Anthony and his team prepared to storm the warehouse. His mind raced with the thought of what they might uncover. Would they finally have enough to take Miles and the others down? As the team approached the warehouse, Anthony's heart pounded in his chest. He moved silently, leading the officers to a position where they could see the meeting inside. Through a cracked window, Anthony saw Miles speaking to Tom, Eddie, and several other officers. Their conversation was tense, filled with talk of removing Anthony from his position, by any means necessary. "We need to make this quick," Miles was saying. "If Daniels finds out we're planning this, it's over." Anthony's blood ran cold. This was it, proof of the conspiracy against him. The betrayal was undeniable. He stepped back from the window and turned to his team. "We have what we need. Let's bring them in." As the officers stormed the warehouse, Miles locked eyes with Anthony, his expression a mixture of surprise and rage. "You think you've won?" Miles spat as the officers cuffed him. Anthony stood tall, his voice steady. "It's over, Miles." Anthony sat in his office, reviewing the evidence they had gathered. He felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, both from the physical pain of his injuries and the mental strain of betrayal. The confrontation with Miles still replayed in his mind. He had gathered enough evidence to begin taking down the conspiracy, but the battle wasn't over yet. His phone buzzed. It was Officer Johnson. "Chief, I've got the files you asked for. We can tie Miles to the illegal transfers." "Good," Anthony replied, his voice steady. "It's time to turn the tables." He ended the call and stood, wincing as his ribs throbbed. The pain would have to wait. He needed to act fast before Miles could escalate the situation further. As Anthony walked through the station, the tension in the air was palpable. Officers whispered among themselves, and the weight of suspicion hung heavy. Miles, sensing that Anthony was closing in, had begun a subtle campaign to discredit him. "Chief," Officer Andrews approached cautiously, "there's been some talk. Miles has been spreading rumors about your leadership. He's trying to turn the department against you." Anthony's jaw clenched. "I expected as much. He's desperate. We need to move quickly before he does more damage," Andrews urged. Anthony nodded. "It's time to take this to the next level." Later that evening, Anthony returned home, only to find his house had been vandalized. Spray-painted threats covered the front door, and his wife, Cynthia, stood on the porch, her face pale with fear. "They targeted us, Anthony," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "They threatened the kids." Anthony's chest tightened as he pulled her into his arms. "I'm sorry. I didn't think they'd come after you." Cynthia shook her head. "It's not your fault, but you need to finish this." Anthony's resolve hardened. His family had become part of the battle now, and he wasn't going to back down. Back at the station, Anthony gathered his most trusted officers, including Johnson and Andrews. "We're running out of time," he began. "Miles is making his move, and now he's brought my family into this." Johnson frowned. "What's the plan, Chief?" "We set a trap," Anthony said, his voice cold. "We'll use a sting operation to catch Miles and his crew in the act. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and this whole thing could blow up in our faces." Andrews nodded. "We're with you, Chief. Let's bring them down." Anthony looked around the room, feeling the weight of the trust his team had placed in him. This was the moment they had been working toward. The night of the sting, the tension was thick. Anthony's team had set up surveillance at an old warehouse where Miles and his crew were planning their final move to oust Anthony. Hidden cameras were in place, and backup teams were ready to move in. Anthony watched from a nearby van, his eyes glued to the live feed on the screen. Inside the warehouse, Miles was pacing, talking to Tom, Eddie, and a few others. "This ends tonight," Miles was saying. "Daniels is done." Anthony's heart raced. He signaled to Johnson. "Now." The doors to the warehouse burst open as Anthony and his team stormed in, guns drawn. "You're under arrest," Anthony said, locking eyes with Miles, who froze in shock. The officers moved in swiftly, handcuffing Miles and the others. As they led them out, Miles sneered at Anthony. "You think this is over? You're just a pawn." Anthony didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." The tension in the air was palpable as Anthony Daniels led his team toward the abandoned warehouse. The sound of footsteps echoed against the walls as they surrounded the building, ready to move in. Anthony's breath was steady, though his body ached with every movement. He nodded to Officer Johnson, who opened the door. Inside, the scene was chaos. Miles Richardson, Tom Briggs, Eddie Garcia, and a few other corrupt officers were huddled together, discussing their next steps. Miles looked up in shock as Anthony entered. "You're too late, Anthony," Miles spat. "You think you can take me down?" Anthony stepped forward. "I don't think, I know. This ends now." The officers swarmed in, arresting Miles and the others. The sting had worked, but the look in Miles' eyes as he was cuffed sent a chill through Anthony. "This isn't over, Daniels. You're just a pawn in a bigger game." News of the arrest spread quickly through Ridgewood, and the town was divided. Some hailed Anthony as a hero, the man who finally brought justice to a corrupt system. Others whispered about the deeper implications of the corruption, wondering how far it really went. At a small cafe in town, Anthony overheard two locals talking. "Can you believe it? Our own police force, corrupt from the inside out," one man said, shaking his head. The other man frowned. "I don't know. This could get ugly for the town. Daniels might have opened a can of worms we weren't ready for." Anthony sighed as he sipped his coffee. He knew the fight was far from over. This wasn't just about taking down Miles. It was about changing the entire system. Back at the station, Anthony gathered his most trusted officers in the conference room. Johnson, Andrews, and a few others sat around the table, their faces weary but determined. "We've taken out the worst of the corruption, but the work doesn't end here," Anthony said, his voice steady. "We need to rebuild this department from the ground up. We owe it to this town to restore trust." Andrews nodded. "It's going to take time, Chief. People are still in shock. But if anyone can turn this around, it's you." Anthony leaned forward, his eyes hard. "We don't have a choice. This department has been rotting for years, and it's on us to fix it." The room was filled with quiet resolve. The battle had been won, but the war to rebuild Ridgewood's police force was just beginning. Later that evening, as Anthony sat in his office, reviewing the final reports on Miles and the others, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Johnson. "Chief, there's something you need to see," Johnson said, handing him a file. Anthony opened it, his heart sinking as he read the contents. Inside were records linking Andrews, one of his most trusted officers, to the very corruption they had just dismantled. Anthony's hands trembled as he realized the full scope of the betrayal. "Andrews," Anthony whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Johnson nodded grimly. "He's been working both sides, feeding Miles information and keeping you in the dark." Anthony's heart raced. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Despite the crushing betrayal, Anthony remained resolute. The next morning, he walked into the station, his head held high. The officers who remained were watching him closely, unsure of what would come next. Anthony gathered them in the briefing room. "We've been through hell, but this department will come out stronger," he said, his voice firm. "We'll be instituting new training, new policies, and I'll be personally overseeing every step of the way." The room was silent, the weight of Anthony's words sinking in. "And to anyone who thinks they can still play games or work against us, know this: you're done. This is the beginning of a new chapter for Ridgewood, and I won't rest until this department stands for justice again." As he left the room, Anthony knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in months, he felt hopeful. The shadow over Ridgewood was beginning to lift, and Anthony Daniels was ready to lead the charge into the light.